So good evening and welcome to Georgia Southwestern State University. I'm Professor Bonnie Levine Bergeron, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's Global South lecture. This lecture series is named after and endowed by the late Professor Emeritus Harold Isaacs, who served as a history professor at Georgia Southwestern for 49 years. During his tenure at GSW, Professor Isaacs taught courses in Latin American history, African American history, and established minors in Black Studies and Third World Studies. In 1981, he launched the Third World in Perspective seminar series, and 2 years later, he established the Association of Third World Studies. In 1984, the Journal of Third World Studies followed. This journal addressed the problems and issues facing less developed countries all over the world. Following Professor Isaacs' death in 2015, the name of the journal was changed to the Journal of Global South Studies and is now published by the University of Florida on behalf of the now named Association of Global South Studies. As part of his bequest to GSW, Professor Isaacs requested that part of his monies be used each semester to bring a guest speaker to campus to talk to the campus community about issues and opportunities facing the Global South. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Dreyer. Mr. Dreyer is graduating with a master's degree in history this May and intends to pursue his PhD. He's passionate about history and nature and worked in ecological education for 9 years. He has worked with PBS Kids Title I school outreach programs, which combines ecology with STEM. He has also worked at Trees Atlanta, which is a not-for-profit which protects and expands urban forests in Atlanta. He has experience as the historic agriculture manager of Smith Farm, which educates the public on the history of pre-Civil War enslaved communities in the Piedmont region of Georgia. There, he also oversees production of organic produce, which is distributed to local food banks. He is passionate about using his research to understand how plants are a vector to gain a window into the lives of the enslaved. His master's thesis compares a collection of environmental and agricultural movements in the Global South between 1980 and 2020. He has presented internationally on this topic at the Association of Global South Studies annual conference in Mexico. One of these movements is in modern Palestine, which is the topic of tonight's lecture. Welcome, Mr. Dreyer.
Okay, I wasn't texting, just so everybody knows. I'm a bit of a talker. I get off subject easily, so I just wanted everyone to know that's not what I was doing. Just setting a timer for myself so I stay on track. Because as Bonnie and Jason know, at least in the conference in Mexico where we both met, I went over a good bit of time, or I almost did, if it hadn't been for other people to stop me. So I'm a bit of a rambler. I get off topic easily, and on a subject like this, that's really, really easy. So I'm going to try my best to not do that. With 45 minutes, I got plenty of time, so I'm feeling good about it. But yeah, I wanted to start off tonight with these goofy pictures of me at Smith Farm. And I do that because I was just at a party the other night, and someone told me that they didn't think that I was a farmer because I looked very corporate. And I took that personally. I did not enjoy that. I grew up in a rural community. I don't know if it's the bald head or what, but apparently I looked very businesslike. So I just wanted to sort of clarify, as these pictures will attest, I am in fact a farmer. I have the hat, and everything to show for it, so I can prove it with this. All those plants, I grew them, so I got the proof, I got the evidence. But yeah, as Bonnie mentioned, in addition to my work in academia, I have worked for the last 6 years as the historic agriculture manager at Smith Farm, which is located at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And at the Smith Farm, it's a real recreation of a historic farm that used to span between 600, 800 acres, depending on the year. Pre-Civil War, was built in 1845. and it enslaved 11 to 14 people on it. And basically, what I do, and the reason I love that job, enjoyed that job, is this job gives me the opportunity to interpret the lives of the enslaved that were forced to work on the Smith farm in Atlanta. Interpret their lives through agriculture, through medicinal plants, through means of resistance that they used to fight their enslavement and fight the oppression that they faced, and use plants and use nature as an educational tool to do that. And I love that job very much, and so that's what I did, and that's kind of what's led me to my academic career. Now I study the history of farmers' movements in the global South. So I'm fascinated by farmers. I grew up in Gadsden County, Florida, which is in North Florida, not too far from here, about 2 hours, I think, away. A community of farmers, historically farmers. And, it's a history that I'm really passionate about. I also love eating. I love food. And I love learning about the people who grow all the delicious food that we eat on a daily basis, consume, and don't think that much about. And we live in a pretty amazing world where we can get food from every corner of the earth. We can get a date from the Middle East. We can get a frozen dumpling shipped here from Asia. We can get an avocado from Mexico all in the same day. That's a pretty amazing blessing in the 21st century that humans haven't experienced for much of our existence. So yeah. So as Bonnie mentioned, we're going to be talking about Palestine this evening. And I kind of wanted to give a little bit of background of why I'm interested in this subject. And give you the sort of the baseline of what we'll be talking about to follow through the lecture. So, my family comes from, I have two different sides. I have one side of my family, I was raised very Scotch-Irish. Went to, Scottish games growing up all the time, had corned beef and cabbage every St. Patrick's Day, grew up learning all about Scottish-Irish history. It's a big part of my family. And on my father's side, I grew up in a Jewish-American family, an Ashkenazi family whose roots, stem from Eastern Europe and then eventually New York, specifically Brooklyn and the Bronx. I grew up with a Jewish-American grandfather who, used to speak, Yiddish, especially, the dirty words of Yiddish. And for folks who may not know, Yiddish is, of course, was a traditional language used by Ashkenazi people in Europe. And it's kind of a mix of, to simplify it, Hebrew and German. And so with those two cultures, I always found them really fascinating. And I was always very interested in them growing up. Specifically, I was interested when it came to the Scotch-Irish. I was interested in their oppression, how they fought it against the English, for instance. Whether it's the Irish being colonized, they were England's first colony. The Highland clearances in Scotland. I was very interested in that. And then on the other side, I was very interested in, my Ashkenazi culture. I was interested about Jewish oppression in Eastern Europe, specifically within, the Russian Empire, ruled by the Tsar before the Soviet Union, Poland, Germany, obviously, and learning about their resistance to that oppression, learning about their culture, learning about what their lives were like in that period. And in both ways, I see these cultures very much as a part of the global South, not, sans the global, within a European context, right? You have the Scotch-Irish on one side, and then you have, European Jewish communities on the other side in Eastern Europe, right? Both oppressed minorities on not within their own spaces, of course, but, within a European context, right? They were people that were, faced either the brunt of imperialism on in the Scotch-Irish side, or they faced, racist, or nationalist oppression on the Eastern European side from, the Russian Empire, from the Polish government, or of course from, the Nazis themselves. And I really am fascinated by learning about how they faced that and fought that oppression. And so with that, growing up, I was really confused about, I didn't really follow anything about Israel, didn't learn that much about Israel, didn't know that much about Israel. I didn't really grow up in a Jewish household, traditionally, and I didn't know how to feel about it, didn't really feel much anyway about it until about 2016, in the war in Gaza then. And I, for whatever reason, it caught my attention, I really started to focus in on it. And I quickly, was fairly confused because again, having not paid that much attention to it, I was I found myself very much not associating myself, with Israel. I very much, like I said, I grew up with these concepts of the global South, as my Jewish background being a part of that global South, right? Being a part of my Jewish ancestry being, something to learn about and to be remembered by its fight against oppression, by its fight against nationalism, against its fight against, supremacist styles of thinking. And what I found myself seeing was a Israeli government that was doing those things to the Palestinians and not the other way around. And so, it left me with a sour taste in my mouth. And so basically that's what made me, along with my career in farming and agriculture and environmental work, really interested in the Palestinian national cause, Palestinian culture, and of course Palestinian agrarianism, farming, their relationship to nature. And we're going to talk about that today. So one of the first things that really got me interested in this topic was these cemeteries. Originally when I started doing my thesis work, I thought I was just going to do a project on traditional Palestinian political parties, or just general political thesis about the history of the conflict through national politics. And I came across these photos that I found really touching, and they said something to me. And basically, you look at them and you see, right, these are graves that are filled with plants, of course, bring flowers in particular, flowers that, we bring flowers to a grave, they're cut stems. Maybe we go to Publix or Kroger or Harvey's or wherever, get some cut flowers, we put them in a vase, and then we put them at the grave, right? I know I did that with some family growing up. And, you come back, they wilt, you just replace them, no problem. But here, I think it's really fascinating. You got, plants that are put in the soil where the person is buried. And to me, that's intentionality, right? You're saying that these plants are rooted where your loved ones have been lost. And I think that's, there's a message being sent there that's an important one. Not the least of which is that, if you're in an arid environment like this, right, like the Levant, where Israel-Palestine is located, in the Middle East, right, this is an arid environment. So someone's coming back to water these plants on the regular, right? If I put some cut stem flowers at a gravesite of my family's, I'm probably not coming back to put water in there, right? I'll probably just come and get some more flowers. But here, obviously, people are bringing water to keep these plants alive, keep these flowers alive, help them bloom, and keep that beauty there. And it speaks to, again, this permanence that people are trying to convey. And I will say this is something that's true of Israeli, graves too, and Israeli cemeteries. If you, look up photos of Israeli cemeteries, you can see something similar. So there's this, this cultural battle almost happening in cemeteries themselves. This photo in particular, I just want to point out is, this mother here, her son's name is Ez, and she, buried her son. Her son was killed in an Israeli raid on their village, or in their city, I should say, because it was in Jenin, which is a fairly large city, not a village. But in Jenin, this comes from a documentary. The photo is a screenshot of which. And, you see her, this is all basil right here. And I grow basil all the time. I love growing basil. It's beautiful. It tastes good. It smells good. And, just watching, in this documentary, this mother, lovingly, take care and prune this basil, water this basil. Again, it's something she's coming back to regularly, taking care of. She's harvesting the basil from it. There's, again, speaks to a real permanence. So I want to give us just some context as we move forward. The first thing I want to do is sort of eliminate the yellow tint effect of Israel-Palestine. Has anyone ever watched a movie about Mexico and it's like shaded yellow? Anybody? No? It kind of looks vaguely yellow? Okay, great. And that's not what Mexico looks like, of course. Mexico looks the exact same way, the U.S. looks, except it's Mexico. But same colors exist. There's not a shade of yellow. But with the Middle East especially, in media, we always see it portrayed sort of either as a drab, brown or a drab yellow. But of course, it's a very, colorful landscape filled with, wildflowers, trees, rivers. And, so this is a gorgeous, gorgeous land, and it explains, why the two peoples that we're talking about tonight, Israelis and Palestinians, both are essentially fighting over ownership of it, or cultural ownership, national ownership, whatever you want to say. And it's a pretty beautiful land, worth defending. And one of the very first things, to go into is that when as you learn about Israel, Israel itself as a country has this idea that Israel bloomed, made the desert bloom. And it was this idea that when, Ashkenazi Jews in particular, came in very large numbers. They had come before World War II in large numbers, but after World War II, those numbers exploded. And the idea was that these Ashkenazi communities arrived in Palestine, and they made the desert bloom. And what they mean by that is they basically were trying to say that what they said they found was a sort of an arid desert, and that it was just that the people who lived there, them being the Palestinians, had not taken care of it, that it was just, sand and barren hills and stones, and there was nothing growing there. And they claim that, through advanced agricultural technology, that they changed this landscape. They made the desert bloom. But that is a myth. That's not true. The agricultural nature of Palestine has been, world-renowned for millennia. And it's a shared heritage. Doesn't belong to just one. Ancient Hebrew kingdoms and ancient Jewish kingdoms have a rich agricultural history, a rich history of terracing, like we see here, of inventing agricultural systems that helped, ancient Jewish kingdoms in this region thrive. But then after that expulsion of Jewish communities, in the Roman era, and then after the Roman era, and many Jewish communities, spread throughout the rest of the world, the various Arab communities and other ethnicities that lived in this space for the over 1,000 years since that time developed their own, agricultural legacy and their own agricultural culture, and built upon it. There's two, but they're building upon one another. It's a shared legacy. And, and again, this history is very inconvenient to this make the desert bloom narrative, because of course, the desert was already blooming before the Israeli nation was founded in 1948. But it creates a very, inconvenient narrative. And even if you don't want to go all the way back to ancient Jewish kingdoms to talk about their agricultural heritage, before 1948, before the founding of Israel, before large-scale European Jewish immigration into Palestine, there was, multiple different Christian cultures, Jewish cultures, Muslim cultures, of course, living within the Ottoman Empire in Israel, Palestine. So we see here, you have a picture of a Sephardic synagogue in Jerusalem in 1893. This is, a Palestinian girl picking olives in the late Ottoman period. And so, this is a multicultural space, and it does not necessarily belong, especially within a modern context, to just Israel. So this is, I know it's a lot going on here. We don't need to necessarily talk about everything on this map, but I wanted to show you all this because this is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as you can see. The West Bank being right here. It's kind of confusing because it's on the east of Israel, but the West Bank is this, and then the Gaza Strip, of course, is down here. And I want to talk about that because, this is a map from 1993, and I want everyone to keep that in their heads, that this is a map from 1993. This was the state of affairs in Israel-Palestine in 1983 after decades of conflict. And so just to split this, just to sort of make some sense of this map, in 1993 we had these purple areas, or I should say, before I say that Israel-Palestine was split into 3 zones or areas. They're area A, B, and C. And basically what they delineate themselves in is the amount of, or the nature of authority within those spaces. So One area is strictly Israeli control, Israeli government control. So civil matters, military matters. And you can see that's this yellow area here. So all the yellow, the light yellow, is Israeli control. And then you have that little orange area, and basically what that is that Palestinians govern themselves in courts, in policing, but the Israeli military still is the highest authority in those spaces. And then if you look in those purple spaces, these purple spaces are the areas where Palestinians have full control, and I put that in quotations marks because they really don't have full control, but that's the idea. Is that they are supposed to be governing themselves, or they're supposed to, I should say, be allowed to govern themselves fully within those purple spaces. And right away, you can say, that looks tough. If let's say you were made president of Palestine in 1993, your entire country is in, it looks like a bunch of puzzle pieces, all, defragmented apart, right? Because it is. And, if you're a Palestinian in 1983, let's say, I'm born in Hebron, and my grandma lives in Jericho, so that means I got to go from here to here. Well, every time I'm entering a different zone, I have to go through a security checkpoint. And that means that I'm going to have to, when I leave the city, when I leave Hebron, I leave the fully Palestinian-controlled zone, I'm going to have to go through Israeli military authority. So that means I'm going to have to wait in line for hours in traffic, probably, to do that. Then you get out of there, then you enter full military control, which brings its, risks of its own for Palestinians. And then you have to pass through multiple settler communities, which we'll talk about in a moment, which are these blue triangles. And then you have to eventually maybe pass through Bethlehem, so you have to get permission to enter Bethlehem from the Israeli military. Then you maybe will leave Bethlehem. You have to, get permission again to leave. And then you have to enter Jericho, once again getting permission to get there. And the reason I say all that is because if you see the scale here, that's only this is 15 miles. And, I don't know about y'all, but I hike with my dog about once a week. I hike, just walking about 5 miles. It takes me about an hour and a half, 2 hours. I could do that in 6 hours. This isn't Florida to California. This is an incredibly small space, and the number of checkpoints and borders that you have to cross through and security points, is pretty startling. And God forbid your grandma's in Jenin, all the way up in the north. Because what would normally take maybe a 2-hour drive is now going to be, it's your whole day, just to get to the top of, what Palestinians see as their own country. And obviously that becomes very frustrating. So if you're a farmer, like myself, and let's say you need a type of fertilizer, let's say you want a specific type of fertilizer that you can't get in Bethlehem, but you know someone who's selling it in Nablus. If you're a farmer, every day counts. Keeping yourself on schedule, harvesting when you need to, removing pests as fast as possible. Time is of the essence when you're a farmer. I'm lucky enough to work on a farm where if that farm does badly, I'm not going to be destitute. I'm not in a financial position where that's going to ruin me. I run a farm that's educational. It's not one that, if I sell produce, I need to sell a certain amount of produce to make my rent or pay my mortgage or whatever. But that's not true for most of Palestine. Palestine is largely agricultural. In the 1980s, agriculture made up about 20% of the Palestinian economy. Today, it's about 4%. So, that's 30, 40 years. It's just, fallen precipitously. And, as we see in America, in small towns and agrarian towns around the world, there's a real loss there. Because as those small farm communities collapse, there's aspects of culture and aspects of community that you lose, and that's no less true in Palestine. So let's talk about what it looks like today. And before I do, I'm going to steal a sip. So just keep that map in your head. Keep that map we just looked at in your head, because it looked really bad then. It didn't look good in 1993, and now we're going to fast forward. We're going to fast forward to 2025. And I basically just want to cover some key things. This is again a huge topic, so I'm desperately trying to stay on subject. So there's so much to talk about, but things have gotten much worse in a lot of ways. The first big thing I want to point out is that Israel recently just announced an expansion of what's called the E1 project. And you can see this is the Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, a very far-right politician. Far-right is probably, honestly, pretty loose for what he is. But he is basically announcing the E1 expansion. And if we go back to this map here, the E1 expansion is basically allowing settlements, which we'll talk about in a second, I promise. I know I've brought that up a couple times. But we'll basically split the Palestinian state in half. Well, there isn't a state that exists now, but the idea is that one day there will be one, and if they, which of course Palestinians want, and this expansion will basically divide the north and the south. So the division will get even bigger. It's already pretty crazily divided, but the E1 expansion will basically split the West Bank in half. So then driving, from Hebron to Jenin will be all the more, impossible. So, that's pretty bad. In fact, Israeli generals refer to this expansion have for years and years referred to it as Sovereignty Road. And what they mean by that is that this project's been in the works for a long, long time, and that they call it Sovereignty Road because the idea is that if that doesn't go, if the UN expansion doesn't happen, that means the Palestinian state will one day exist. So you have to, get rid of Sovereignty Road. You have to create the E1 expansion to prevent that. And you really can't talk about Palestinian agrarians and Palestinian farmers without talking about settlers, which I've mentioned a few times already. Settlers have been a problem for decades in Israel-Palestine. Basically what they are is they are illegal under international law, first and foremost, but they're Israeli, they're exactly what it sounds like, settlers who enter the West Bank, and set up these little camps, what becomes settlements. First they start as what are called outposts. They'll set up like a van, and they'll put an Israeli flag up, or they'll put up a couple tents and put up an Israeli flag. And they will set up shop and basically say, this is Israeli territory now. And again, mind you, it's not, right? It's not Israeli territory. This is Israeli territory. This is the West Bank, and this is the Gaza Strip, which are supposed to be, again, the basis for a future Palestinian state, or that's the idea under the Oslo Accords, which, took place in 1993. But what settlers want to do, what Israeli settlers want to do is they want to come into this space, and they want to say, we want to create what are called facts on the ground. And what they mean by that is that they're fully aware that the United Nations, the international community, is not fully enforcing the Oslo Accords, right? And there's very little punishment from the international community if Israel in particular breaks international law. So what they say is, well, we'll just go in to the West Bank and we'll set up shop and we will, settle there, set up camps and towns, and the Israeli military will protect us, and eventually these towns will grow, which they have over the years. Some are pretty big, some are basically suburbs. And then IDF battalions and military units will be stationed there permanently, and these will grow. Each settlement will get bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually, essentially that area, is no less than Israeli territory. And the idea being is that one day, even though technically the West Bank is supposed to be the basis for a future Palestinian state, it'll be indistinguishable from Israel. And nobody will ever be able to turn back the clock, so to speak. And so they go into these areas fully armed, as you can see. You can see the clip of ammunition. He's got a whole assault rifle. And that woman there is a French-Palestinian woman named Alice Cassia. She is from a Palestinian Christian family. And they've been fighting for control of their farm for, I believe it's 20 plus years that they've been basically battling what are called hilltop youth. which are basically kids. I mean, they're literally younger than y'all a lot of times. They're like 14, 15. They'll come armed. They'll go on top of the tallest hilltop near a Palestinian community and they'll just set up shop. And then they'll basically come down from that hilltop and they will just harass Palestinian farmers. They will, they'll set fire to olive trees. They'll scare away, they'll shepherd maybe sheep in or cattle and, make a land barren by letting them graze in an area, like an area full of crops. They'll come in and they'll just, intimidate them. They'll come armed, obviously. They'll point guns at people. They'll scare them away. They'll bring clubs. And they'll also just set up shop in people's houses. They'll just go into a farmhouse while someone's out of town. And as we talked about on this page, it takes a long time to get place from place. So farms can be abandoned, abandoned, not literally, but someone can leave their house, be gone for 6 hours. And a Hilltop youth member will see that. They've probably been watching that farmhouse or that, the village house or whatever, and they'll just break in, set up shop, and essentially squat in there. And again, they're armed and they have the backup of the Israeli military, so who's gonna, stop them? Nobody is really the reality. The best that Palestinians can do is, this sort of civil resistance in any way that they can. And that can be legal, that can be literally confronting them, which again, talk about the bravery of this woman, Alice Cassia here. Again, that guy has got a full AR-15 he's strapped with, and deaths of Palestinians by settlers is very not uncommon. In fact, it's fairly common. And, it takes a lot of courage to be, that direct with it. She is accompanied in this particular photo by Israeli activists, peace activists in particular, who are supporting her in trying to drive these Hilltop youth away. So, she's able to do that, but if you can imagine when Israeli activists are not there, or international volunteers aren't there to help, Palestinians and bring awareness to the subject, it's a lot more risky. One big issue lately is that, the Israeli military is supposed to be the main arbiter in the West Bank of security is the idea. But increasingly, as you can see, settlers are basically dressing up as the military. It's also getting very indistinguishable between what is the military and what are settlers, because a lot of times, I would say more often than not, the Israeli military is very sympathetic to the settler movement. This comes with a trend of 30 plus years of very, very far-right rule in Israel. And the settler movement increasingly, they're wearing uniforms. Like if I hadn't had that caption there and I told y'all this was the Israeli military, I don't think anybody here would necessarily stop me. But these are settlers, but they have full fatigues, they're wearing flag patches, they're very well armed. I would have no reason, if I was a Palestinian, to not think that's the IDF. But in fact, they're, again, internationally illegal settlers who are, dressing up as the military is an added way to intimidate Palestinian farmers. And I don't want to lose track of Gaza, because Gaza's in a different situation. Gaza, as we go back to this map, had settlements in it actually before 2006. It had Israeli settlements inside of it. And in 2006, the Israeli government actually forced those settlers out in an agreement with the Palestinian Authority, the ostensible government of Palestine. And the settlers were actually forced out of Gaza. And the reason I bring that up is because it shows that the Israeli government, the Israeli military, is capable of forcing settlers out of spaces that they legally should not be. But they're not willing to, right? There's a political willingness to let them stay, let them continue, their work. I just want to bring that up because, again, they can do it, they don't want to do it. The big thing I will point out with Gaza is Gaza, right, an incredibly small space. Again, that's 15 miles, so you're talking like 3 miles here, 2-3 miles, incredibly small space. And, so they rely a lot on urban agriculture, ostensibly. It's not literally urban agriculture, but these incredibly, micro farms, essentially, that produced large amounts of not enough food for their community, but were able to do some pretty amazing work with the incredible small space they had in Gaza. And these farmers had to work with, the bare minimum, because what could be brought into Gaza was extremely restricted. So if I wanted to get, I use seed trays a lot for greenhouses to get my plants ready for the next season. And seed trays would essentially be banned under Israeli restrictions because a huge quantity of plastic items, plastic containers, were just outright banned by Israeli border authorities. If fishermen wanted new fishing nets were totally, banned for years and years and years under the Israeli border restrictions that people in Gaza had to deal with. So if they wanted certain types of fishing equipment, if they wanted greenhouse lights, or if maybe you raise chickens and you want warming lights, right? You want lights to keep your chicks warm while they're getting bigger, little baby chicks. Those lights were banned for huge quantities of time. If anyone's ever used a greenhouse and they've used like a warmer to keep the seed trays warm to help them grow faster, again, that's something else that would have been banned. So they had to make do really with what they had and, with this limited space. In addition, they are restricted, specifically the fishermen were restricted to this incredibly small maritime border. And the maritime border, very conveniently ended right before the channels of the Mediterranean start to get really deep, which, I'm not a big fisherman, I'm raised in Florida, but I don't have that much of a fishing background. But the deeper channels, right, have a bigger bounty of seafood. And so their maritime boundary really ends right as it starts to get deep. So they're never really able to access the large quantities of seafood that they, historically used to be. So they're really cut off to this extremely small slice of the ocean that they have to harvest from. So I have a little video for us. And I wanted to sort of give some context for these settler attacks. I basically just want to show this. This is a Jewish American independent journalist named Jasper Nathaniel. He does some really amazing work, and he does investigative work in the West Bank, and in the West Bank he basically follows Palestinians, see their lives, see their experiences. And he recently was there and followed Palestinians into their olive fields in a town, or a village, I should say, called Ter Messiah. And in Ter Messiah, this is a town that's 80 to 90% Palestinian American, which is really rare. But this is a town that is mostly American citizens of Palestinians. So keep that in mind for what we're about to watch. And basically, he survived a settler attack and is basically just describing, what happened during this settler attack, play by play. So, just to give you a little context before it starts, because I cut off the interview, it's just a short segment of it. Basically what he's saying is that he was trying to ask Israeli military forces to help the Palestinian farmers escort them safely away from settlers during a confrontation. And the Israeli military said they would, and then right after they said they would, they drove away. And so that's where this clip leaves off.
Promised us safe passage out of the olive fields.
So they bring you up there, they desert you, and then suddenly these settlers come. Are they armed?
They were, the first guy that we saw had a pistol, and he was pointing it at us. To the extent that I was able to get a good look at the mob that was chasing us, they were wielding these huge clubs. And, I think a lot of the time when people see videos of settler attacks on the internet, it's maybe a couple of settlers who show up and start harassing Palestinians, and then there's a confrontation, and then they attack. But in this case, it was clear that this was a planned ambush. Again, it was the first day that the Palestinians had gone back into the olive fields that these settlers had occupied, and they showed up basically as an army. With these clubs that had clearly been, built as weapons, and they were there. They were out for blood.
They weren't just sticks that they picked up.
Oh no! I mean, these are. I mean, they look like golf clubs almost. I mean, they have these big knots at the end that were able to break through our windshields.
So, talk about what happened. How you discovered this woman.
So I am running away in that video that you show, and I reach the bottom of the hill.
I'm going to show that video as you talk.
And when I get to the bottom of the hill, Yasser, the guy who I was with before, is down in the car, And he's stuck though, because now there's basically a bottleneck of cars trying to get out of the olive fields. And I jump into the car, and this mob is right behind me. One of the settlers, who was sort of out in front, really big guy with a big club, wearing a mask, is right behind us. He smashes through our rear windshield
With the club.
With the club, 5 or 6 times, and again we were stuck. And so both the officer and I thought, these guys are going to drag us out of the car, and who knows what's going to happen. And I should say, a couple kilometers away, a 20-year-old Palestinian American, Saifullah Musalat, was beaten to death by a mob just like this in his olive fields. And so this was sort of on my mind as this was happening, that this is how it happens. The guy smashes through our windshield, and then he actually runs out in front. There's still a huge mob behind him, sort of showering us with rocks and beating cars, lighting cars on fire. And then we see out in front a woman, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, standing under an olive tree. And she had been there picking olives as part of the harvest. And the settler just sort of beelines right to her. And it was the single most heinous act of violence I've ever witnessed, and I've seen a fair amount in the West Bank. He clubbed her once, knocked her completely unconscious. And
clubbed her head?
Yes, and then he stood over her body and struck her twice more in the head while she was down. And then the mob kept running, throwing rocks. It was just a full-on attack, basically.
Yeah, so pretty difficult stuff to watch. And I will say that woman did survive, just to let y'all know. She is alive today. Thank God. Getting struck in the head multiple times. People have I died from head injuries, a lot less than that. But yeah, I just wanted to give y'all a taste of what these settlers' attack look like. Right? These are brutal. I have no hesitation to call this like terrorism in itself. And, I'm going to speed up a little bit since we're running out of time. But the other big threat to to Palestinian agrarians is Israeli agribusiness, which are and international agribusiness. It's not just Israeli agribusiness. Basically, this is a threat to, farmers around the world, not just Palestinians, but Palestinians are no exception to it. But, agribusiness basically taking over, the agriculture industry, whatever you want to call it, agriculture as a whole. Putting smaller farmers out of business, farming communities, it's forcing them to sort of disappear in favor of large agricultural conglomerates. There's a lot of things to talk about with the Israeli agribusiness field, so I'm going to speed through it here. But basically, the first thing I want to say is there's a real collaboration with the Israeli military defense industry. Elbit Systems, which is, I have a headline there. Apparently they're supplying North Dakota farmers, that's news to me, with drone technology. But basically, they test a lot of their military technology in agricultural means first. So they will, try drone technology to drop, let's say, a type of pesticide on crops, or maybe to survey fields. That test of those drones, then of course, doesn't take much to turn a drone from dropping pesticide into dropping a bomb. So there's the testing there. In addition, Israeli agribusiness, because of Israeli farmers being forced out of work, either because of settlers or because of lack of access to international markets, has made a huge number of Palestinians, about 7,500 before October 7th, 2023. Relying on basically what we would think of today in the U.S. as migrant, migrant agricultural labor, and they have to pass through these security checkpoints, actually go into Israel, work on large-scale Israeli farms, then go back into Palestine, and for low wages, of course. It's very similar dynamic to what we have here in the U.S. Also, water is a huge one. The Israeli company Mekarot, which they own international branches too. They also run water systems in Argentina. And Mekarot, basically they charge really high prices for water. They have full control over water. Again, it's an Israeli company, has basically full control of the water system in the West Bank. And they charge really high prices for water, and they give really low access. So it's really hard for people to connect to water systems or get a lot of water. So a lot of Palestinians rely on rain catchers And again, they charge really high prices for, piss poor service. And then the last big thing is introducing crops that, don't grow well there, but can grow there with a lot of inputs. So I just have an example here is there's a growing interest in Israel of introducing tequila, essentially, Israeli tequila, and to bring agave plants in, which agave basically doesn't need any water. But they, for whatever reason, these agave farms put these water lines that, water agave plants. And this one in particular is pretty egregious. This specific agave field is just like a couple miles from the Gaza border. And this picture is from about 2024. And so again, this is a plant that basically needs no water, but for some reason is being given lots of water, lots of agricultural inputs and energy to make tequila, which they have to ship to Mexico to be made, and then get shipped back to Israel to be bottled. They're doing that, again, 2 miles from the Gaza border as the war in Gaza is going on, and as folks probably know, people in Gaza experienced extreme hunger, famine, as it's been described by, international bodies and Israeli nonprofits, lack of access to clean water, and I just think that's a pretty jarring thing. This is basically just a little bit of background. Palestinian agricultural resistance is not new to the modern period. Women, in particular, Palestinian women, the popular women's collectives would basically share seeds, share tips on food preservation, help each other harvest during the first Intifada, which was in the late 1980s, early 90s. And then the UAWC, which is the Union of Agricultural Workers Committees, was a Palestinian organization that was, started again in the 1980s, 1990s in the first Intifada to basically train Palestinians in agricultural skills and share seeds, distribute seeds freely. So this is not a new thing to Palestine. Basically the next 3 slides are basically be talking about the 3 different areas of agrarian activism that I think are the most important. The first one, of course, is agroactivism, and basically this is the work of farmers, fighting for farms, fighting for food sovereignty on their farms. And I kind of highlight 3 people here, or 2 people in particular, I should say. First one is Vivian Sansour. She's this amazing woman right here. She runs what's called the Palestinian Heirloom Seed Library, and this is basically a nonprofit that has collects rare Palestinian heirloom seeds. Which an heirloom seed, that's what it is a whole argument with a lot of farmers. But basically, it's a historic, traditional seed that basically you can usually trace before World War II, and usually has a long historical legacy going back to a specific culture, to a specific region. If you go to a farmer's market today and get just a big, delicious, plump, red tomato that's all shaped really weird, right? A big, beautiful southern heirloom tomato. That's sort of an heirloom that belongs to us in southern culture. And Palestine, has their own versions of this. And so the Palestinian Heirloom Seed Library collects stuff like okra, zucchini, watermelon, and tries to promote for free its distribution. So basically they collect these seeds, they've saved numerous species from what was thought to be extinction, and they distribute them to farmers and encourage people to grow them on their own farms. And the reason they do that is because, as with farmers around the world, especially in the global south, cheap, modified varieties of seeds are a lot of times they are promoted to farmers for higher outputs, for ease of growing. But a lot of times those seeds, are sterile. So what that means is if I use a sterile modern version of a tomato that I grow one season, and it makes a nice tomato, whatever, pretty easy in a greenhouse or a hothouse or whatever. If I want to seed save from that tomato, I can't, because that next generation of tomato will be really bad. It will basically be really poor quality, or that seed won't grow at all. And heirlooms don't do that, right? You can just continually seed save forever and pass it on from generation to generation. And it's important because every time you seed save, you are when the idea of seed saving is you pick the best plant from your garden and those seeds you want to save. And the reason you do that is because you're trying to basically get the best possible seeds for the next season. So that improves each successive year's output. So that means that if you grow a tomato one year and it's delicious and the one plant has just the tastiest, yummiest tomatoes on it, and you save seeds from that, then that next year you do it again, and it basically improves its output within the microclimate that you live. And that's in an era of climate change. It's really, really important to do that because you're basically making those plants resistant to types of pests, for types of weather that are increasing, unfortunately, in their how often they happen. This is a man named Mohammed Saleh. Mohammed Saleh basically specializes in building urban farms, especially in refugee camps, of which there are many in the West Bank. And one problem he faces all the time is just the amount of glass and basically stone and concrete that he finds from ruins and sort of destruction from conflict, but specifically from tear gas. Because tear gas is used so liberally, which across the West Bank by Israeli occupation forces, tear gas is really toxic. It's actually banned under the in 1992 basically treaty on conflict, international treaty on war, and says that it cannot be used in war, but it's still used in policing. The U.S. still uses it commonly in policing, but it's a very toxic substance that actually is leaching into the soil. And so a lot of times he finds soil that's really poor because of large quantities of contaminants from tear gas. There's also food is a big one. And these are folks who basically just want to make Palestinian food like French food, like Japanese food. They want people to think about kanafa and hummus, and they want to think about Palestinian olives. They want to think about Palestinian food the same way they think of French food, Japanese food, whatever. They want to think of it as delicious. And so you have women like Mirna Bamiyeh. Mirna Bamiyeh is basically, she runs this thing called the Palestinian Hosting Society, which hosts dinners focusing on culturally significant food in Palestine and making them a beautiful affair, right? And the idea of hosting in a country like Palestine, where people are they're moved around constantly, they're forced into refugee camps, they're displaced regularly throughout the last century. The idea of hosting in a home, and not only hosting people in your home, in your permanent residence, but hosting them in a lavish dinner is it's a big deal. And so she does that at the Palestinian National Museum. This man named Sari Khoury, who runs a vineyard in Palestine, and he was able to actually grow an heirloom crop of grape that he named the grapes of wrath, which basically he found grapes that were able to grow through the ruins of his destroyed farm. Basically, his farm was destroyed by Israeli military bulldozers in I believe the early 2000s. I could be misremembering, but basically one of his vines actually survived and was growing through the rocks and the rubble. And he basically, he's cultivated that grape and bred it to grow more of these vines, and now he makes a wine out of it, again, called Grapes of Wrath. And then, of course, there's Anthony Bourdain. I love Anthony Bourdain. And he actually went to Gaza in 2006 or 8. I can't remember the exact year. But you can still find this episode online of, I think it's Parts Unknown. He's had a lot of shows. But it's pretty surreal to watch, I'll be honest, again, because he goes to Gaza October 7th, so it looks very different. It's pretty tough watch, to be honest. I relate a lot to Anthony Bourdain. He is half Jewish himself, and so his feelings on Israel are pretty interesting to hear, and I relate to them a lot, frankly. And but basically, he goes to Gaza and experiences Gaza food through a Gaza chef named Layla El Haddad, who you see there. And then there's foraging. Foraging was a huge part of Palestinian culture for centuries, specifically plants that belong to the za'atar, which is like a spice blend. There's multiple plants in there, but the plants within za'atar, and then also a koob, which these women are cutting up, which is like a type of thistle. They basically, it's pretty nuts, it's pretty blatant, but basically Israel has prohibited by law any foraging of a koob or za'atar. And so Palestinians, can't do what they've done for centuries, is just forage. And one of the ways they've done this is by making a massive number of national parks and nature reserves throughout both the West Bank, again, which is supposed to be a future Palestinian state, and then also throughout, just in the West Bank. And throughout all of Israel-Palestine, there are over 500 national parks and nature reserves, which for context, America, which obviously, is much, much, much bigger because Israel-Palestine together is only about the size of New Jersey. They have over 500 national parks and reserves, and the U.S. only has about 430 or 420. So more than us. And again, the reason being, it cuts off a hell of a lot of land if you have land that's totally off limits to anybody. From Palestinian villages, Palestinian foraging, Palestinian, self-sufficiency, so to speak. And today, za'atar is sold around the world. And again, it's not just from Palestine; it's from the Middle East in general. But it's pretty crazy. I was just at Publix the other day, and I saw za'atar in the spice section, and I thought that was pretty nuts. That I can buy za'atar, again, a half Jewish American in Georgia, in Atlanta. But a Palestinian can't just go outside, walk into a field, and start picking it. That's illegal, and he will be fined like $230, and for a first offense. And then future offenses include, fines of over $2,000 or jail time. So I mean, it's pretty blatant. And then there's a great documentary about this called Foragers. If you have any interest in this topic, it's directed by that Palestinian woman, Jumana Mana, right there. Just some more pictures. We're getting to the end here, running out of time, so I just want to basically just some more pictures to show us. This is Vivian Sansor collecting, Abu Samra wheat, which is another one of these heirlooms. This is she runs this thing called basically this heirloom kitchen, basically, where she has farmers bring food from heirloom seeds that they've grown, and she will actually make food from it with volunteers, and then she'll treat people in different cities, Palestinian cities, to that food and show them how much better it tastes, and show them the difference between that and then like the store-bought variety, much of which is imported in from Israel or from around the world. The Jadui watermelon, this is an heirloom watermelon. The watermelon has a long historic legacy in Palestine. It's native to the region. It's, a lot of people know that watermelon is a sort of a symbol of Palestine in common parlance. And it's not just because, the watermelon has the same colors of the Palestinian flag, black seeds, red, meat, and then green, outer casing. And it's not just that, it's actually a long cultural legacy of tons of watermelon recipes and watermelon crops, growing watermelon. We'll move along here. And then sort of the last final things I want to talk about, because I know I'm already over. I told y'all I would talk too much. But the last things I want to talk about is volunteers. There's a huge, Palestinian farmers basically are really on the brink, and they're really the only people holding sort of, them back from, these hordes of settlers, ostensibly, literally at their doorstep or inside their doorstep in a lot of cases, are what are called olive kin, or what Palestinians refer to as olive kin. And these are basically international volunteers that come to the West Bank and will actually work on Palestinian farms and will be farm protectors ostensibly, and will stand with Palestinians ostensibly, making any Israeli settler attack really risky for them politically. That's the idea anyway. The idea is that, right, if you harm, let's say, an American activist who goes to the West Bank and helps Palestinian farmers, right, the idea is that the American government is then supposed to tell Israel, like, you need to get these settlers under control. They can't attack Americans. That doesn't happen, unfortunately, really. That's the idea anyway. And as you can see, multiple activists have been killed, including Turkish-American Aysenar Egi. It's been going on for years. Palestinians really honor these folks for their sacrifice. I will say Rachel Corrie, an American who died way back in 2003, again showing this is not a new, even though it's obviously been in the media a lot more lately, Rachel Corrie was literally run over by a bulldozer in 2003 while protecting a Palestinian home. And Tristan Anderson, another American activist, was shot in the head with basically a tear gas container, if I remember correctly, and is permanently injured for the rest of his life. And to honor them, regularly basically planting olive trees in their honor, again showing the importance of the olive to the Palestinian culture and Palestinian national image. And as you can see, the IDF does not take kindly to that. I mean, this image drives me crazy. I mean, this woman, is no threat, and this guy has a gun that's as big as he is, pointing it at her, while I think she's trying to help a man up at this tree planting event. I mean, it's pretty nuts. And these are regular, olive groves, because the olive harvest is a huge part of the economy. In Palestine, olive oil especially is a huge, one of the only major, financially beneficial exports of Palestine. They're a huge target of settlers. So burning these olive trees, which to be clear, olive trees are, they're beautiful, but they can live for hundreds and hundreds of years. They're just gorgeous, gorgeous trees, usually planted, generations before people were born in land, that their family's from. And if you want to plant a new olive tree, it takes 3 to 5 years for it to even bear fruit. And it takes 10 plus years for it to come to full bore and, bear the sort of fruit that you need for, selling it en masse. And so to burn down a grove of them is a huge deal. And to end on a happy note, I want to point out they're unfortunately, a minority of the population, a very small minority, but there are a number of Israelis and just Jewish community members globally who stand beside Palestinian farmers all the time and, risk their lives, frankly, their well-being to help Palestinian farmers and, show solidarity with them. And you have Yehuda Shaul here, who's an Israeli who served in the IDF, and he formed an organization called Breaking the Silence, which basically the idea is he wants former IDF members who have served in the West Bank to come out and basically talk about crimes that they witnessed, talk about the mistreatment of Palestinians by the Israeli military. You have Eric Asherman, who I believe is Israeli. I can't remember if he is Jewish American or Israeli, but Eric Asherman, he runs an organization called Rabbis for Peace, which basically he goes out and he farms olives with Palestinian farmers, basically daring settlers to attack him, which they have. He's been recently, I think in 2025, he was actually knifed by settlers. He is alive and well. There used to be a restaurant called Majda in Israel, which was owned by, I believe, if I remember correctly, a Palestinian wife and an Israeli husband, or vice versa. I can't recall, but unfortunately, it closed after October 7th. Because of, I believe, protests, if I recall, against it, essentially, just for, intermarriage, essentially, this sort of. But all that to say is that there is a movement of Israelis and, Jewish communities around the world to say, this is ridiculous and this has to end. And so that's it. So thank you all so much for inviting me. I will say it's been pretty cool to be at Georgia Southwestern with all this Jimmy Carter lore everywhere. Rosalind Carter lore, because Jimmy Carter was actually very outspoken on this issue, especially towards the end of his life. He spoke out for Palestinian human rights and national rights very strongly, and so it's it felt very cool to drive up here and see all the Carter stuff. So I know we have no time, but does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? If not, it's no worries. I want to, very badly. I'm hoping that in my PhD, I unfortunately am in a financial position where I have to work full time. But my hope is that PhD-wise, I'll get funding to go there. And I would very much like to go to, see these farms myself and, No, that's a great question. I think if I had to guess, that's so tough. Honestly, I'd never thought about that. I think I would probably the seed saving, I think, because I do a lot of seed saving and heirloom, specifically heirloom Southern American, South crops, watermelons, tomatoes, eggplants. It's honestly a lot of the same stuff Palestinians grow. and just our own, variety of it, ostensibly. And I, would probably want to see those seed libraries, and I'd like to see people seed saving. I think that's really interesting, just for my own sake. If I do it all the time, I think it would be really interesting to see. And also because they're also under attack. That picture I showed earlier, way back here, right? This is a raid on a UAWC office, which again, they distribute seeds, like save seeds. And this was an Israeli, basically the IDF claimed that they were, linked to the PFLP, like militant faction, or the militant wing, I should say, of the PFLP, which is the Palestinians, Palestinians for Liberation of, Party for Liberation of Palestine, excuse me. There's so many acronyms on this topic, but which is like a left-wing party in Palestine, and they basically accused them of being a militant wing of that, which they obviously deny, and I believe the charges were dropped basically wholly against them. But, and I worry about the Palestinian heirloom seed library as well, because to my understanding, they've had to move a lot of their operations to the US. And I haven't been able to find a lot about like the means of that. I'm sure they're not dying to share that information in mass either, for obvious reasons. So, yeah, vegetable markets are also a regular target of raids. There's a really big one in Ramallah that was burned down in 2025 that sold a lot of heirloom vegetables. Yeah, so I think that's a long answer for what I would probably prioritize.
Sure.
A couple of peculiar questions. First, I can't get it. I've seen conflicting reports about how many Israeli citizens who get military exemptions for service end up being members of settler militias. I've seen differing reports on that. Do you have a particular take? And I have a totally different one.
Yeah, there's no like hard research, I don't think, that I've ever seen on like the background of settlers. I have seen reporting on a couple different topics of them. One of them being from exempt groups within Israel, groups that are exempt from the draft. For anyone who doesn't know, that Israelis have to serve a military term or be exempt for various reasons. So they're either exempt from exempt groups or vice versa. One really interesting report I saw recently is that a lot of them are foster kids within Israel, who are then basically these families within settlements will adopt them. And then a lot of the hilltop youth, ostensibly, are just, again, I haven't seen like percentages or numbers, but a large number of them are foster kids, which it puts a really dark tinge on the fact that a lot of these, not to by any means excuse the actions of these, these guys, but like that a lot of them are basically, being pushed, the kids being like to the fringes of Israeli society or being put on the front lines of this violence. Because some of them, like I said, are like younger than 18. And you often wonder, like, who are these kids' parents? Like, what are they doing? Like, I mean, I've seen videos of like 13, 14-year-olds with like clubs and guns just like sitting on couches in like Palestinian living rooms, and you just have to ask yourself, like, who is this kid? Like, the other thing I would say on that is that a large number of them I do know, again, I don't have like a hard percentage, but are first-generation immigrants. Especially from Eastern Europe and like the Balkans, who are moving there. From my understanding, not a lot of settlers are like second, third generation Israelis. They are first generation immigrants from the U.S. There's one guy from Texas, owns a really famous settlement winery, and then you have a lot of Eastern European settlers who first generation come in, and then they immediately go out to a settlement, to the point where a lot of them, like they're still, like their first language in country is like Russian or is, another Eastern European language. I mean, my take on that is as bad. It's pretty bad. I don't really know what to say on that. I mostly just say my take is like, I mean, I think they're being used essentially as shock troops by the Israeli government. One thing I've heard from like Israeli sources is that a lot of Israelis, again, having never been to Israel, Palestine, I'm not talking to a lot of folks directly there, but like, I've read from a lot of Israeli sources that a lot of Israelis reference Jasper Nathaniel, I know, writes on this, that guy who talked earlier, that a lot of Israelis talk about settlers as the bulletproof vest of Israel, and the idea being that like they don't like them, like they know they look bad to an international audience, they know what they're doing is like largely wrong, but they don't really mind because the idea is that like they're the front line bearing the brunt and kind of doing what a lot of Israelis, frankly, again, because Israel has a very large right-wing contingent. The left-wing, or the peace faction, I should say, of Israel is very small, unfortunately. Right now, it's just a fact, and a lot of Israelis just kind of like what they're doing. And they don't mind that they're doing it. They know they look bad, but they're like, I won't do it. I'm going to stay here in Israel. But like, you can go and do it, and in 20 years, if you get the job done in their eyes, like I don't think they mind, I guess is how I've seen it said.
You have time for a second question? Would you promise to keep it short? Okay. I'm interested in nationalism and the concept of nation, and obviously culture is one thing one can use to create a national concept. Food culture, obviously, is part of culture. I really don't know anything about Jordanian food culture. What are the ties between Jordanian food culture and West Bank food culture? I mean, obviously they were all part of the Ottoman Empire, but I mean, how much historically have it been?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not an expert in like Jordanian culture, so what I can speak to though is that, obviously there's a huge Palestinian population in Jordan, because of the attached border to the West Bank and the historical ties between Jordan and the West Bank. But in terms of nationalism and its relationship to food in particular, I will say that I didn't get a chance to talk to her because I realized I was like, oh my God, I have so little time. I've been talking so long. But in the food culture, one thing I was going to mention is that a lot of Palestinians, Myrna Bamia, that woman I mentioned, she's right there. She talks about a lot about the theft of food, essentially, or the relabeling of food as Israeli. So she talks about hummus specifically, kanafa, which is like a really good, super good like dessert, Palestinian dessert, or maklub, which is like a pilaf, essentially, like a Palestinian pilaf. And she talks about, along with a lot of other chefs, including Layla Haddad there, talk about around the world they're marketed in restaurants a lot of times as Israeli. This is Israeli maklub or Israeli kanafa or whatever. And she has she talks about the fact that how brutal that is to see, and she talks about how older Palestinian women tell her that basically feels like a repeat of the Nakba, right? The forced expulsion, because it's basically saying like this food that you've had forever, like is not yours anymore. I mean, it'd be like, for instance, like my family's along with these myriad of other cultures I described, like we're very Southern. Every New Year's we have black-eyed peas, rice, collard greens, cornbread, hot vinegar, and it would be like suddenly that's Brazilian, right? That's a Brazilian food, or that's Chinese, or that's English, and that's not Southern anymore. And so she also, Layla Haddad too. She's basically a collector of various recipes that are disappearing really fast. Same with Myrna Bamia, and she talks about how a lot of like older Palestinian women who she wants them to share their recipes, share these recipes that they cooked before 1948, or maybe their mothers cooked before 1948, and a lot of them don't want to. Like they actually find it really difficult because it brings back so much emotion to do that, because they haven't, they don't make it very often. They have so many memories with it, and they have specifically memories associated with people that are long gone or maybe died during the various like wars, specifically, the original, Arab-Israeli conflict, so it's the food wars are very, very strong, and over who owns what. I see it a lot with like Mediterranean restaurants. I think are really interesting. You see everywhere. I mean, I had it for lunch. It was really good. I don't know the origin of the Mediterranean restaurant in like downtown America. This was really good. Rave reviews from me. But you see Mediterranean restaurants everywhere, and of course, there's not really a Mediterranean food, right? There's national foods that are similar based on that. But you often, when you dig a lot deeper into like Mediterranean restaurants, a lot of times, what I found, because I'm obviously fascinated in it, is a lot of times they're owned by Palestinians or Israelis. And I think that's really interesting, is that I don't know, I can't really speak to it, I'm neither Palestinian nor Israeli, but the reading I always have of it is that, I think a lot of Palestinian Americans, at least not in large areas with Palestinian American populations, don't want to put Palestinian, because they don't know how Americans feel about it. And then Israelis don't want to do it for the same reason, or because, again, they want a huge part of the Israeli national identity is this idea that they're indigenous to the land. That's why Hebrew was adopted as the national language instead of like Yiddish, for instance, like Ashkenazi's community, or Arabic, which Mizrahim community spoke, or and I don't know what language Sephardic Jewish community spoke, but I have a feeling it wasn't a large portion of it wasn't Hebrew, and and a lot of Israeli historical figures changed their names, their original names, to names that the reason they gave them. I can't speak to like the reason they changed their names individually. But they certainly changed them to be less Eastern European, less Ashkenazi, which hurts me because I'm very proud of my Ashkenazi culture. It's something to be proud of, and they sort of cast it aside as something of the past to be thrown away. Whereas to me, that's really gross. That's sort of way too big of an answer. I got way off track. I forgot the original question was about food, but yes, that's my vision.
Thank you, Mr. Dreyer, for your participation this evening, and thank you to students, faculty, and staff for joining us, and to GSW TV for filming this event for us. Good evening.